up is Kathleen Kaveny, who's a scholar who focuses on the relationship of law, religion, and morality. And she is the Gerald and Julia Libby Professor at Boston College, a dual appointment in the theology department and in BC's law school. Jim Keenan, to her left, is the Canisius Chair, Director of the Jesuit Institute, and Vice Provost of Global Engagement here at BC. Leslie Woodcock Tentler is Emerita Professor of History at the Catholic University of America in Washington, where she specializes in the history of American Catholicism. She wrote a terrific book on birth control. That's sort of the standard work on it, I think. And to her left is our honored author, Jumatul Janzut, who is the university historian and Clown Professor of History Emeritus. And his book, which we're discussing today, has just been published by Harvard University Press, and you can buy a copy of it immediately outside the door. I strongly encourage you to do that. And who's playing you? I heard this rumor, Jim, that the aging Johnny Depp is playing you in the made-for-TV movie. So what I told people is everybody has 7 minutes. I will be the movie's timekeeper, and we'll move to the next person. So there will be 3 panelists, after which Jim will have a chance to respond to them. We'll have a conversation among ourselves, and then we'll open it to all of you, so we'll have a conversation with the audience. So we'll start with my very smart colleague, Kathy Kate.
That sounds good. May I ask an act of charity of you? Could you hold this?
I can do that.
Thank you. And I can too.
Okay. I'll control this thing.
Charity is best when shared. Is this on? Is this on? No? How about now?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I am delighted to be here and to celebrate the publication of this book, which I highly urge you all to get and read. You may look askance at that recommendation, thinking like, who wants to read a turgid academic book, right? Why not wait for Johnny Depp? But what's wonderful about the book is that it's really a wonderful read. It's a page turner. It moves very quickly with a nice amount of analysis and stories and poignant even insights about the past and the present. So my comments are going to be a little bit strange because I was thinking I'm in a strange position on this panel. Unlike the moderator and Father Keenan to my left, I am not a priest. I have never heard confessions. And unlike, really, my other panelists, Dr. Tentler, Father Keenan, and Father Massa, including and the guest of honor here, I'm not a historian, so I can't really comment on the whole history that he lays out so well in this book. But what I am is a participant observer. I grew up in the late 60s and early 70s, and you might say that I was a human subject of the change in confession practices. And without actually going along with the ethical criteria for research on human subjects, I need to say, they just threw us in it and changed it without talking to us. So I just want to talk a little bit about what it was like to be a young child going through these changed experiences in confession. Well, the first thing was it changed very quickly. It was called confession. Then the next year it was called penance. Then the next year it was called the Sacrament of Reconciliation. What was it? Could we get that straight? There were boxes, confession boxes, that some people, including my parents, went to. But there was this newfangled thing called face-to-face confession, which was not made as available to us as an option. We were, in fact, required to go to our first confessions face-to-face. And then there was this newfangled thing that appeared, and Jim talks about this, and then disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived on the scene, a group confession, a public confession in the church. So what about confession in my own experience? Well, as I was going through school, my first 3 years were at a Catholic school, it moved from first grade, before First Communion, to 5th grade, well after First Communion. So you got your First Communion in 2nd grade, and then you wandered around committing sins until you took care of it all in 5th grade. So the process was most people went in 5th grade to go to the sacrament of confession, and then went again maybe in sophomore year when we were doing confirmation, and then frankly that's all she wrote. That was it for most people that I knew. My own experience of it wasn't bad those 2 times. Been a little bit more than that. But I do...
We find ourselves in the confessional mode here.
Confessional mode, seeking absolution. I went before, we went to face-to-face. We didn't have a choice. And I remember being awfully upset that the priest kept smiling at me throughout the confession. And I thought this was beneath both his and my dignity. We had been told to take this seriously, and he obviously was not taking it seriously, which feeds into some of the, I think, problems. I want to reflect on just a couple of points that this experience helps me to look at Professor O'Toole's assessment of the decline of confession, and especially in my generation, but even after. First, he points to the rise in psychology. People went to psychologists rather than to confession to deal with their issues. He points to, and I'm sure that my colleague, Father Keenan, will speak more about it, moral theology shifting focus to enduring attitudes, fundamental option for or against God, rather than specific sins. And then really the lack of fit between bigger issues of social sin, how am I contributing to racism or sexism or economic injustice, and the actual acts that are confessed in confession. I think all of that's true, but I'd like to suggest a couple of other things as well. One, I think pushing it back till later, from 2nd grade to 5th grade, really had a significant effect on people's sense of its importance. You know, if it could wait that long, maybe it could wait even longer. Second, a point that I don't think really came up as much as I experienced it in the book was the shift of a lot of people from private schools, Catholic schools, to public schools, and therefore to CCD programs. So if you're in a CCD program, even if you don't see everybody going to church or going to confession, you don't see older kids going to confession maybe on First Fridays the way you would in if you were in school. So again, it seemed like something, you know, kind of odd and not that important. And also, being in public school, there was an awareness that other Christians and other good people of other faiths had other ways of dealing with their sins. The Protestants went directly to Jesus. Why couldn't we go directly to Jesus? Was there something about Jesus that we didn't know? So this points to a couple of deeper underlying issues, I think, in my education that points to a little bit of the decline in confession. First is a kind of incoherence in the view of God there. On the one hand, we were told Jesus loved us unconditionally, wanted us to love him, understood us better than we understood ourselves, and we could go to him with anything no matter how serious, anything no matter how trivial. But, ... you had to get your sins forgiven by going through a priest, through a sacrament of confession, and dealing with this particular formula. Wasn't entirely clear how these two views coincided, which raised a second problem. I don't know how to put this exactly, but there was a sense that there was another shoe about to drop. Not a very nice shoe in my whole catechetical education, particularly around confession. The generation that raised us had been raised themselves in the pre-Vatican II church and imbued with a pre-Vatican II sensibility. Now they were trying to move beyond it toward a more positive and capacious view of God, but they still communicated to us, I think, some sense of hesitancy and uncertainty and maybe even ambivalence about the shift, try as they have tried not to. So then you sort of stumble across some of these older views of confession and sin and hell, and you think, well, wait a minute, maybe somebody's not telling us the whole story. Maybe there's something horrible we need to know, but we haven't been told, like death and taxes. Maybe there's something out there that's really horrible that's about to drop.
You have a minute.
And what that turned out to be was actually the sex abuse crisis. So as we got older, those of us who were stayed didn't really have a place in our imaginary, our social imaginary, to put the sacrament, character traits leading to sinful behaviors, not isolated sins, exploration of our faith. Confession didn't lead to that. We wanted a combination of maybe confession and spiritual direction that we didn't have. 2 minutes in a confessional seemed more like a magic act, not a sacrament. So that's not the great story, but I think that's what it was like to experience the shift, and I'll end there.
Thank you for your confession. Dr. Cathleen.
I take it this is still on.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I also want to begin by praising Jim's book, which, apart from its graceful writing, thoughtful analysis, and thorough research, is also leavened by his trademark sense of humor. Younger Catholics especially will find this book a revelation. It will read almost like ethnography, with the skilled anthropologist, that would be Jim, reporting on the strange doings and peculiar customs of a now pretty much extinct tribe. Not having been raised Catholic myself, I did not have the experience of confession in the pre-Vatican II church, but I was nonetheless fascinated, in a horrifying sort of way, by what actually went on in that dark box, mainly because of my Irish granny, who padded off to confession every week. What could she possibly have to confess, I used to wonder. Did she make up sins on her way to church? And why, my teenage self would wonder, would she willingly subject herself to what seemed to me like the worst kind of humiliation and surrender of personal autonomy? Many years later, in the course of research for a book on birth control, which is not a how-to book, I basically assure you, I found myself wrestling once again with the question of sacramental confession. Private confession was obviously a critical way to enforce a teaching that by the 1950s was really singular to Catholics. That is to say, no use of birth control under any circumstances whatsoever. So I needed to come to a more sophisticated understanding, shall we say, of what went on in that sacrament. Like Jim, I found manuals for confessors and the teaching notes of moral theologians to be of enormous use. But I also interviewed 56 priests, all but one of whom had been ordained prior to the council. And they were enormously helpful. I not only learned a lot from them about how agonizing hearing confessions about contraception could be, but I also learned, and this I think is very important, how essential the hearing of confessions was to their sense of themselves as priests. It reinforced for them, they told me, their sense of men set apart for sacred purposes, of men with powers no other clergy possessed. So the collapse of confession, as Jim quite accurately describes it, contributed, I think, in a major way to the crisis in priestly identity that comes so quickly in the wake of the council, as significant numbers of priests resign and seminary enrollments literally plummet. I think one of the most poignant moments in Jim's book comes toward the end, where a pastor in a small Massachusetts town describes to him how he hears confessions nowadays. He says, well, I go over to the church on Saturday afternoon and I putter around. And if anyone comes in wanting to confess, I hear their confessions. It seemed to me he's gone from judge and doctor of souls to parish handyman. And it was a very, very sad moment. Research on the birth control book also introduced me to a subject that Jim addresses with particular acuity, and that is the impact of psychology as a discipline on Catholic moral theologians, and therefore also on confessors. This is in the years after 1945, when American culture generally is suffused by enthusiasm for various varieties of popularized Neo-Freudianism. I would add one footnote to that splendid chapter, and that does concern birth control. Priests who were involved in the various family life movements that are so important in this period when it comes to pre-marriage instruction and ministry to couples seem to have been particularly affected by psychology, and particularly by the widespread assumption that a healthy marriage needed a robust sex life. And so you find in pre-Cana instructions and other family life ministries an emphasis, a growing emphasis, on the importance of frequent and spontaneous and joyous sex, which is sometimes actually likened to a sacramental encounter.
You have 1 minute. I was going to say this earlier. I wanted you to finish that.
What happens is that this talk about the need to greet your spouse in this wonderfully joyful and intimate way runs right up against the teaching on contraception. And I think what happens is a lot of devout Catholics learned from their priests, their psychologically sensitive priests, how to talk back in confession in the 1960s, when apparently people began doing that, perhaps as a prelude to not coming at all. I just, if I've got a moment, want to close with a tribute to my late brother-in-law. As the father of 10, I think he may have been my inspiration to study this. He was purely a product of the pre-Vatican II Church, and apparently once said, before I knew him, that he hoped to die backing out of the confessional. What does that imply? Both great faith in the efficacy of the sacrament, but also a belief in the existence of hell as a well-populated place. And I would suggest that perhaps the most important change in the wake of the council is that we stop talking about hell and about mortal sin. And in those circumstances, perhaps the relevance of frequent confession ceases to have much meaning.
Thank you. Jim, colleague Jim Keenan.
So a couple of things. First, I'd like to just commend the work. It's really an easy read, a good read, and a deep read. And I found, just to give you 3 different little indicators of how widespread Jim taps into different issues. On page 36, he mentions simply that the confessional was built as a response to sexual abuse. When churches, they had to take confession out of the rectory, where most confessions have happened. And the confessional is an instrument so that you can confess in a public place but have privacy. So the next time you see a confessional, realize that sexual abuse was going on in the church before that confessional was built, and not after. So that's the first. The second is Henry Leeds. To see his name in the book is really great. Henry, we all know him. He wrote all about this matter in detail. And if I'm right, he was not Roman Catholic. He was writing about this quite a bit. So there's always been a fascination by Protestants on Catholic practice of confession. So you have forebearers. The third is your mention of Karl Menninger. Because Menninger begins to raise a question about whatever happened to sin. As his therapist, he's really concerned about the lack of culpability in people's lives. The lack of a recognition of culpability is a significant resting human development indicator. And so it's really one that I hear in this is, how do we acknowledge sin? How do we acknowledge the need for reconciliation? And in a way, you're basically positing that as a problem in the wake of everything that happened. I want to tell you 3 different stories about my experience of confession. I remember when I grew up in a parish in Brooklyn, where, you can tell by the accent, in Brooklyn, where we had 4 classes per grade, 2 boys, 2 girls. We had 75 students in each of those classrooms. We had 300 students every year in a class. We had the Sisters of Mercy for the girls and the Brothers of the Holy Cross for the boys. We got a splendid education, but we had everything in detail. I can remember when I was 9 years old, having a very long discussion with a friend as we walked home for lunch about wouldn't it be great to have a confession and then get hit by a car, because you wouldn't have to worry about any difficulty. But we were 2 9-year-olds having this discussion. This was not a rare moment. This was something that had come up because they had been raising these questions about this. So that gives you one instance of how things were. A second one is, I got to know Horace McKenna, a wonderful Jesuit down in Washington, and I worked with him for a summer. And he told me about how when the priest, this is about Patrick O'Boyle, when the priest in Washington had to have a vote as to whether or not they're concerned that they would not hear confessions, they were going to protest about confessions over birth control when Humanae Vitae came out. And a group of priests, about 50, more or less, 50 priests, were going to take a stance, and they were trying to decide whether to go public or private, whether they would just send a letter of protest or they would publish this letter of protest. Horace fell asleep during the meeting and woke up, and Horace woke up at as they were taking the vote and realized that it was a tiebreaker, and he voted to go public. He voted to go public. He was the confessor to Patrick O'Boyle,
Who was the Archbishop of Washington.
who in a step of penalty, told the priest that they could not hear confessions for the next 2 years. So he had basically taken away from his own confessor the right to hear his own confessions. There is this famous scene where Boyle is asked Horace, why did you do this? And he said, 40 years in the confessional, Cardinal, 40 years in the confessional. He had to take a stand over the Humanae Vitae thing because of all his experience in the confessional. So back to what you're saying there. And the last one is that I had the privilege of hearing confessions in Rome at the Jesuit from 1983 to 1987. I have to tell you that the experience of confession there, in the heart of a city that was really marked by all sorts of different political and ecclesiastical issues, was far more complex than what I was normally accustomed to. But a few things. One of the things is, I think a colleague of mine, Jack Morney, who wrote The Making of Moral Theology, he basically says, what really brought all this down was the itemization of sin. We subdued sin by name and number. Once we could give it a category, I masturbated 16 times. I ate meat on Friday 3 times. We subdued sin. Instead of appreciating the theological significance or the personal significance of sin, we subdued it. We gave it a number. I cursed somebody out 4 times. I wanted to kill somebody 6 times. You know, what does that mean? What type of psychology is going on when all of a sudden really heinous actions are coming down to this? I can name the times and I can name the instances. This itemization of sin, we basically subdued sin. We gave it into categorization, and it became deeply problematic. And I do think that that has some relevance here. And another point on this, as sin as a thing, is that, back to Menninger, I do think that we never really fully worked with, other than the itemization of sin, how we talked about culpability and how we did that. And I'll use this as a closing example here. I was teaching over at the CSTM, an intro course to fundamental moral. And I wanted to do something on guilt. And my students all said, no, we want to talk about shame. And I said, well, you talk about shame all the time. You know, you got pastoral counseling, you got everything. We all have a lot of shame, and everybody's always talking about it. But one thing is, we're not talking about guilt. And that's what those of us in morals are interested in. We're interested in guilt, responsibility. We're interested in accountability. We're interested not in how you feel so bad about yourself because, some people are ostracizing you, like shame, but rather how you feel because you recognize the fact that you have caused harm somewhere to someone, indirectly or directly, but by your actions or by the withholding of action, you have not made the world a better place. What about guilt? We talk about guilt. And they all rebuffed me, and I said, well, you're going to get a lecture then on guilt. So I did on guilt. But what I encountered there is a contemporary resistance of guilt and a Catholic almost pathology that I need to talk about my shame. So I leave it there.
Right. So Jim, our author, our honored author, here's the body.
Oh.
Well, thank you all for the close reading, and I obviously appreciate the positive comments. Several of you, not you, Leslie, because you weren't raised as a Catholic. A couple of you, Kathy and Jim, have talked about your experiences, particularly in confession, particularly as children, for the most of the period that I was writing about in the 20th century, the kids went to confession for the first time when they were 7 years old, in the second grade. First communion had been, which used to be later, was lowered to the age of 7, and the understanding of the church was, if they're going to go to communion, they have to go to confession first. I think even at the very beginning, most people in the church, certainly most priests in the church, recognize that this was a bad idea. That if you imprint on 7-year-olds this way of thinking about guilt and shame and culpability and so on, that's maybe going to get them into the habit of going to confession on a regular basis. But it's going to imprint some habits that are going to stick with them for life and are maybe not going to accomplish the purpose. I found evidence, I quote one priest in the book who says that he heard the confession of a grown man in one time, and the grown man had confessed to talking in church as one of his sins. Now that's something obviously a 7-year-old might say. With regard to particularly your experience, Kathy, of not going to confession for the first time until the 5th grade, there was a movement in the 1970s after the council to separate First Communion from First Confession, and to keep First Communion at 2nd grade as it had been, but to delay First Confession until maybe 4th grade when the child was 9 or 10 or something like that. And American bishops were very keen on this idea, and the practice really spread very quickly in this country. Everybody who was exposed to that thought this was a good idea, that kids are simply more ready for understanding these kinds of issues. It was immediately squelched by Rome. I think the fear was that, if they didn't get into the habit of going to confession right away, they wouldn't as adults. Maybe so that happened anyway. But I think that was one of the changes that might have made a difference in confession faring a little better after the 1970s. Childhood experiences, as long as we're talking about our own experiences, my early confession experiences turned me into a little lawyer. I decided early on that disobeying my parents was the prime sin. And that even if my parents hadn't specifically forbidden me to do something, if they knew I was doing it, they would have. And so therefore it constituted a form of disobedience. In my confessions, my numbers of disobedience were always very high because I was lumping a lot of things into that on the theory that saying that is better than going into more graphic details about things. So again, the pattern of childhood confessions, I think, had those kinds of effects. As to the whole presentation to lay people, the way lay people were taught to understand the sacrament and as well as to carry it out, by the end of working on this, I came to think that it was really quite remarkable that the church thought that lay people could grasp this system, which was a very highly articulated, elaborated system. Mortal sin and venial sin. Sins of omission, sins of commission. The three categories that made a sin a mortal sin. Occasions of sin, not sins themselves, but occasions that might lead you to. That's a very elaborate kind of system, and the church had confidence that sure, ordinary people can grasp this. They can then apply it to themselves and use it as their framework in confession. That, it seems to me, is kind of, especially with a largely working class church in the late 19th and early 20th century, that strikes me as really a remarkable kind of thing. And if that is remarkable enough, they thought children could grasp this system. They thought that 8-year-olds could grasp this system. And you know, they obviously grasped part of it. So all of that, it seems to me, among other things, that's what made me interested in this as a topic. Two other things I'd say. One, you know, I think of myself as a social historian, and I was primarily interested in lay people's experience of confession. But I also wanted to know about the priest's experience of confession in all of this. It was certainly one of the things that priests did the most of. In the average parish, parishioners and pastors encountered one another most often in the confessional. In the dark, anonymously and so on, but it was there that these two people were talking to each other. At Sunday Mass, the priest was a remote figure standing up on the altar far away. So I knew that confession was central to priests' ministry and therefore to their identity, as Leslie has said. That was a tough nut to crack. You know, when someone's in the seminary, they can't hear confessions for practice. They have to already be ordained for that. So I wanted to know how priests were trained for that, and textbooks and lecture notes of seminary professors that I was able to find got me to that. And lastly, just to the point of psychology and the impact of psychology, the spread of psychology in American society, the spread of the acceptance of psychological concepts. I knew going into this that was going to be an important part of this story, but I'm not sure I realized how important it was and what an effect that had, such that by the 1960s and 70s, confession is being praised not only for its sacramental religious impact, but specifically for its psychological impact. And confession is coming to be defined in psychological terms, not just the theological terms of the textbooks and manuals and so on. So I'm going to leave it at that.
Thank you. I have a question. As you know, a couple years ago I wrote a book on natural law after Humanae Vitae. And it seems to me it's kind of hard to overestimate how important Humanae Vitae is for raising questions. And so I was talking about your book at dinner at St. Mary's Hall. For those of you who know St. Mary's Hall, there's all these lively conversations among the Jesuits at St. Mary's. And I said, there were 6 of us at the table, and I said, when was the last time that you heard a confession where someone came in and confessed the use of birth control? And no one had ever had a confession. Now, I know some of you hear this regularly, but to me it's quite striking that, you know, we went from a time before 1968, which was Humanae Vitae, where going against a papal teaching like that would have been considered a very serious sin, to now where, when I hear confessions, not so much. Do you want to?
Yeah,
Jim, could you put
I was just going to ask a question. I mean, if you look at some of the younger Catholics, they're different. Some of them are progressive, but there's a group that's also a little bit more conservative on sexual issues, and including on Humanae Vitae and on practicing of confession. I don't know how to put this delicately, but do you think perhaps it's possible that they might think Jesuit confessors might be a little too lax. The people who would be likely to confess that,
us, yes.
that the people who would be likely to confess that might want to go to a different brand.
Actually, that's not the case. You would find some Jesuits who would be promoting this and gathering students together. I think that students find Jesuits to be on the spectrum of, a variety of different
On all kinds of
positions, theological and political, and that they find hover with one person or another. But I know that there's an active confessional ministry by several members of our community, for instance.
No names, okay.
I can assure you that even by the early 1970s, I'm finding written sources, or I did when I was working on birth control, where priests would say, nobody is confessing it anymore, and we don't ask. And then, of course, fewer and fewer people are going to confession. But I contrasts with one of my best informants of my interviewees, a man ordained in 1945, and somebody with a natural historical sense. And I remember his saying, remembering Trinity Sunday, or the Saturday closest to Trinity Sunday, before Trinity Sunday, and he said, there would be lines around the block, and it would all be birth control.
Let me just say a word about Leslie's book on Catholics and contraception, which is all over my footnotes, but it's also a terrific contribution in general. And the special contribution it makes is all the interviews that you did with priests. Bishops can do what they want, theologians can write to one another however they want and train seminarians and so on. The priests that Leslie was interviewing and made such good use of what she found in that book are the ordinary, on the line guys in the parishes, meeting actual people. And I think one of the results of that was they felt the anguish of lay people in a way that others and leaders in the church did not. So that was a special contribution.
Jim, did you want to say something? You're holding the microphone.
No, I'm holding it so that I can pass it around. There are people there.
Okay, all of you.
Jim, I wonder if you could say why you think confession as a practice has actually dropped out. It cannot simply be because of Humanae Vitae. Surely there must be other reasons.
That's exactly right. And in fact, a lot of people thinking about the subject quickly say, oh, well, it was after Humanae Vitae. I say explicitly in the book that lay Catholic rejection of the teaching of Humanae Vitae, lay Catholic rejection did not in and of itself cause the decline of confession. They coincided in time, but it was not a straight line from one to the other. I think moreover, there were larger issues at stake. One was the changed way in which the church started talking about sin. Sin is not just lying to your parents or pushing your sister or cheating on your taxes or your spouse. It's racism, sexism, damaging the environment, and so on. The church started a more expansive, for my money, more positive view of the morals and ethics of this world. So that's a step forward. The problem is it's hard to talk about that in confession. If I accept that damaging the environment is in some larger sense sinful, great. How do I go into the confessional and claim my personal share of that? I started the car this morning. It didn't match, the practice didn't match up. So I think that was the larger context for Humanae Vitae. The other aspects to this, I think, were, especially as levels of education among the Catholic population in the United States rose, people started to notice that a lot of what they were confessing was trivial. Again, maintaining these childhood practices. I found one laywoman who said that, well, when she went to confession, she understood that the priest had to act like a judge, you know, what she had done. But if he was a judge, she said, he's only in traffic court. You know? And I think that I think people could say, it's supposed to be this big serious thing, and I'm talking about Wilson. So I think it was that combination of factors, as well as starting to think of things in psychological terms.
So, two recent comments prompted this question. Back when birth control was a sin, were there many women who would come in practicing birth control for very good reasons, health, or already got 10 kids or whatever, confess it as a sin, knowing they were going to just continue doing it, and what, confess it again at the next, or just skip it? I don't
There's
know.
the firm purpose of amendment, and the problem with a sin like birth control is that you've got to have a firm purpose of amendment to keep doing it if you want it to be effective. So if that's, you know, it's, I mean, right, you get what I'm trying to say. I mean, it's a sin you have to do over and over and over again, as it were, to make any sense, to have it work. But yeah, that's where people, they ran up against it. People would say, yes, I committed this sin, and then you have to, you know.
I just also want to get on the table, you know, the gender issue too. I mean, I think feminism, the experience of women as being, you know, agents, of being, you know, of being people who, you know, should not be totally subordinate to men, even to priests, was also making women question, you know, there seems something wrong with this. Could I go to confession to a nun? Is there somebody, not an N-O-N-E, an N-U-N, a sister? Is there a way to, this seems a bit more embarrassing and a little, you know, a little gendered and patriarchal.
Yeah, and also, there's a couple of in line, and I saw more David. But I mean, I think several of you sitting here have said, and this has happened to me here in confessions, especially when you hear confessions of students, they come back and week after week, they confess the same sin. And at a certain point, you say, why are you coming here? Is your understanding of confession that it's like it was Fulton J. Sheen's angel on the blackboard? I'm erasing all the chalk on the board and you're free to do this? Because as Leslie said, it's the intention of not continuing to do it that's part of importance. So people started saying, no, what is going on here? Like, why are people confessing the same sin again and again and again, week after week, with no amendment at all?
Well, I'll underline Kathy's point about women's experiences in confession in particular. Priests probably wouldn't notice this. They're all men. But when a woman went to confession, she was always talking to a person of the opposite sex. One of those things that now seems perfectly obvious, and yet didn't matter, or people didn't notice, or people didn't act on it.
I don't find that true. I disagree.
So they're talking to a person of the opposite sex?
That we didn't realize that we were.
Oh.
That was the first one.
Jeff? Sure.
I asked Mark if I could give a brief report from the field. I'm Jeff Lenarks. I'm a Jesuit. I'm at the Jesuit community in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Last year, I was asked by the pastor of St. Paul's Church, which also houses the Harvard Catholic Student Center, if I could help them with confessions because they had so many penitents. And I said yes. So every Saturday afternoon from 3 until 4:30, it usually goes until 5, I'm in St. Paul's Church with another one of the parish priests, so there are two of us. The confessions go from 3:30 straight on until 4:30. Often I'm there until 5 o'clock. It's one right after another. I suspect that I hear 20 plus confessions in the course of a Saturday afternoon, plus the other priest, and so I think there are between 40 and 50 confessions that we hear. Most of the penitents are young people. Most of them are Harvard undergraduates because I ask. Most of them, but certainly not all of them, are men. They have a very traditional understanding of the sacrament. Bless me, Father, 5 sins a week since my last confession is not at all unusual. They have a very traditional understanding of what is sin, what constitutes sin. They're particularly focused on sexual sins, and so typically the confession is, bless me, Father, 5 sins a week since my last confession. I watched pornography and I masturbated. These are all my sins. And I want to say, you think? but I don't. And these again, these are Harvard students. They are not stupid people. But this is the experience or the understanding of sin that they have. They've started a second confessional opportunity for people on Thursday afternoon at Harvard, which is also full. My understanding is that there are a significant number of penitents at confession here at Boston College, and my sense is that at a number of other university settings that this is not an unusual experience. So how you integrate, Jim and I have talked about this, how you integrate that, Jim, with your sense that, confession is dying. It's certainly not dying with that particular demographic. And where they're getting the catechesis that they bring to the sacrament is a really good question, which I don't have an answer to. Where does this come from?
You want to answer that?
I'm interested in those two questions, and then I'm going to say something.
Oh, sorry.
I'm just trying to make sure that the people in the audience can ask their questions. You've been waiting for 20 minutes.
Can I just make a comment on just Mark? Some of the early reviews of the book from a variety of sources have criticized it, and in particular criticized my use of the word collapse to describe what has happened to the practice of confession by American Catholics over the last 50 or so years. And those that have pointed that out said things like, well, at my university, students are lining up for confession. A priest at Notre Dame has told me this. I know that here at Boston College is the same thing. The Church in the 21st Century Center has an annual confession festival, sort of, in which priests are spread out on the lawn of St. Mary's. I understand this year it was rained out, but the attendance at that. My response to that, well, first of all, my response is, look, I'm a historian. I don't do the present, I do the past, and I think I'll stand by collapse to describe the past. But also I think, okay, college students, Catholic college students are going to confession with their friends now, and they're doing it on a regular basis. Interview those kids 10 years after they graduate. Will they still be going to confession on a regular basis, or indeed at all? I think we know the answer. Many of them will have started raising families, and not to be too glib about it, they'll be going to the Church of Youth Sports on Sunday mornings. So I don't see this surge among college students. However you judge that, and I think it's fine for what it's worth. I don't see that as a sign of a turnaround and a return to the days where every parish in the city of Cambridge is hearing that many confessions on a regular basis. So anyway, I think we've got to be careful about overgeneralizing from what I think are unusual specific situations.
Mark, would you just give us a minute?
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to say about the Pew study?
Oh, I just, before I got here, looked up a Pew study on practices of American Catholics that came out this year, 2025. 20% of U.S. adults are Catholic, 50% pray daily, 28% attend Mass weekly, 23% go to confession once a year, and 13% of American Catholics do all three things. 47% never go to confession, and 13% never do any of these things. So, I think that if you look at the broader survey of Catholics now, that helps balance sort of the specific situation of some college students.
That's second statistics, 47% never.
Never go to confession. 23% go to confession once a year.
All right, so the question, I have two questions actually, just in case my first question is one you're not really prepared to talk about. I just got the book, haven't read it yet, but I'm struck by the title, The Rise and Fall of Catholic Confession in America. So could a similar book be written about the rise and fall of Catholic confession in other parts of the world? I don't know if you're prepared to talk about that. If so, is it for the same reasons? If not, what's going on in America?
I'm not prepared to talk about it. As a, American history is what I do. I have a general sense that in Western Europe, the situation is at least as pronounced and probably began sooner. Just correlating it to regular mass attendance and so on. But the rest of my knowledge of the rest of the world is really insufficient to answer the question. I have the sense that it's probably on the decline in Latin America as well, but I couldn't document that.
So then let me ask my follow-up. Why confession? Why that sacrament? Why did you decide to write on that one?
Oh, well, I've been interested in it for a long time, and a couple of things. I got interested in it when I was working on a different project altogether, and I was reading the diary of a priest in New York City in the 1890s, who was a Jesuit. He was in St. Ignatius Parish in Manhattan. He'd had a long and interesting previous career. But he sat in the confessional every weekend hearing confessions, and he was a man who liked to count things. Every time a parishioner came into his confessional box, he made a hash mark on a sheet of paper. And then he added it up and recorded these numbers in his diary. He was like an accountant. He'd bring forward last week to get to this week. He'd compute a semi-annual and annual score, he called it. And I was reading the diary for other reasons, but I was interested in the fact that he was doing that, and he would say things like, the pace today was slack, only 77. Another time, 160 was a fair number. And I was interested in a world in which 77 confessions at a single sitting was an only. So that just kind of intrigued me about this. And lastly, I'll say, just as a historian, I was intrigued by the prospect of studying something that left no documentation, that left no records in the normal course of business. It's conducted in secret. Nobody knows what is actually said in a confessional. I was intrigued by is it even possible to do this? I used to joke with my graduate students that this was the kind of project to undertake after you had got tenure, because you might in fact not be able to do it. So it was that challenge that also led me to this segment in particular.
Let that, and then I'll go. Okay, I'll
Right. Thank you very much. It's been a great talk, and appreciate it written. I'm coming from the perspective as a psychotherapist, where my office has been filled. And it's been a very interesting process of thinking about what has been a journey for so many Catholics who have now gone to therapy instead of confession. But at the same time, what I have found has been the experience that they have used it to truly understand themselves in a way that they now have a better understanding how to live their lives. And I remember particularly one person who, part of his therapy was talking about the challenge and how he arrived at a number of issues in his life. And then I said to him, did you ever think about going now to confession? Which he did, and found enormously helpful, because he had been able to get to a point where he truly was able to understand himself in such a manner that the confession could now be something that was a relevant experience. And then his going forward reflected that he now was at a different place. And I think that's the challenge for the church today, about how to think as adults to talk about the meaning of confession in such a manner that then, instead of thinking of it as 7-year-olds, what it would be like to really think about, well, what are the things that matter, and what do you do when you then understand things to live a different life? It can be better, and therefore there is a different relationship. So I think the integration of it, and then again, I would be curious about other therapists who've ever mentioned about going to confession at one point, the benefit that was they've experienced because somebody really now got it.
Yeah, so I'd like to follow up on that.
I remember my dad having to have open heart surgery. And after my brother Bob died, he was 26, I was 27, he stopped going to Mass. He could not, he was in too much grief, and he couldn't go to Mass at all. And now, 8 years later, he's waiting for open heart surgery. And a chaplain comes in and says, do you want to have confession? And my father said, well, maybe. I need some help, though. He said, I haven't been to confession for 8 years after my son's death. I just didn't know how to go back to the church. And he said, well, so it's been 8 years you haven't gone to confession? He said, yes. And he said, okay, so there's 52 Sundays in a year. And my father said yes, and he said, so multiply that by 8, and you have over 400 sins there. And then he said, and then there's Fridays in Lent. And my father said, I have to stop. I use that because I think many people moan because of what you just said. That as a matter of fact, he wanted confession. He wanted some sort of sacrament of reconciliation. He wanted to be able to talk about that he had sin in his life, and he wanted to acknowledge that. And he wanted to be reconciled. And that's what I'm trying to do here. Like, I think that there are many of us who would like to see not that this sacrament is discontinued, or not that the younger people who are practicing it will eventually walk away, but as a matter of fact, that something actually could happen, maybe by your book in part, that we look at what are we missing, not of what we once had as a practice, but what we once understood could be the sacrament. And if we had a sense that we could go and confess our sins in a way that we understood, one, what sin was, and two, why we had these regrets, that it could be a good sacrament worthy of consideration. So, and my experience has been in any number of times after Mass, somebody coming up to me saying, I'd like to talk. And occasionally they may say at the end of that conversation, could you hear my confession? But I don't think we have yet figured out, because I do think there was a collapse. There was many collapses that happened in these times, but there was a collapse. But there's another sense of that there's something missing. And I think that many people are here, in part because of this book that you've written, as to saying, yes, there is a lacuna, now how do we address it?
I think that's exactly right, and I was pushed by the editors to say more about this in the book than I intended, but I think the church is at a point where it needs some new form.
Yeah.
All the evidence is that the old form doesn't work anymore, and maybe bubble up in pockets and so on, but across the board that's just not going to work. What we need is some newer form. Now, as a historian, I think it'll take 300 or 400 years before that form gels, just as it took 300 or 400 years for the practice of auricular confession to gel in the early Middle Ages. But I think you're exactly right.
Yes, sir.
You know, sort of following off the psychotherapy view, when some of you were talking about the the lineup of students who are going to confession, saying the same thing week after week, going back to what Father Keenan said, that could also be a searching for something. And I think we dismiss that too quickly. We're really losing the opportunity. The other question I was going to ask, although you really stole my thunder with the discussion that came after this, was I feel like we're sitting at the taxi drivers union telling stories about what it used to be, and Lyft is taking us over. We only have a certain amount of time. And I was kind of wondering, but what do we do with the position if we believe the sacrament is of value? What do we do to make it not be just like taxis?
Not my job as a historian.
Actually, the sacrament of confession has gone through many iterations over the course of, in the early church, there was no regular confession. So that's why Constantine waited until he was literally on his deathbed to be baptized, because if you were baptized and you committed a sin, that was it. And then eventually there was communal confession.
confess to the whole community, and they decided. And it was the Irish monks who came up with this idea that we have a regular confession, and you go to, individuals go to priests. That was fairly late, but it sort of worked for about 600 or 700 years. So the question is, I don't think anybody doubts that the sacrament for reconciliation is a valid sacrament, it is useful. The question is, what should it look like?
Yeah.
You know, is auricular confession the way to go now?
We gotta make it more like a lived in
Can
text.
I say something? Just, I think that part of it means that people have to incorporate some of the best parts of therapy and the best parts of spiritual direction into confession. It can't just be, a land speed record. Well, I heard 300 confessions in a half hour. Yay me! I'm going to go to the Olympics on that. People, and I do think if dismissing the fact that part of sinning is a lack of hope and a lack of sense that you can get out of a bad habit. So confessing the sins that you keep doing is a way of trying to remain in contact with, the divine and trying to change a bad habit. So I don't necessarily think that you keep going in as, well, I did this again, is necessarily a sign that it's not working. I think it's a sign that human beings are difficult. One thing I want to bring up, though, where it's still a problem, where the old view is still a problem, is there was a document called Amoris Laetitia, where in footnote 8 of Amoris Laetitia, where they, the Pope said, well, you could, in a second marriage, even if the first spouse was alive, under certain circumstances, if it were stable, go back to communion. And part of what was at stake there is a different notion of sin, right? Because you're saying, well, I had my first marriage, it didn't work out, it's over in some sense, and I'm moving on, I can confess the whole thing. But the standard traditional view is every time you have sex with your second spouse, you're committing adultery against your first spouse, and therefore you don't have a firm purpose of amendment. So, this is still causing issues, not just in, in what goes on in the sacramental context in confession, but in how we think about marriage, how do we think about a sin against marriage, and how do we think about a new life?
If I could, on one thing, there's a book by Hugh Connolly on confession in Ireland, and it's fascinating because what he wanted to do is, everybody was talking about the Irish penitentials from the 8th century on and how they itemized the sins, maybe 14 sins for each of the 7 deadly sins or the vices that they had. And so and they looked very monkish, the sins, as a matter of fact. But one of the things is that his study, and everybody thought they understood Irish penitential, Irish confession because of that. And it wasn't until 30 years, well, actually 40 years later, where Hugh Connolly does this study to find out more context that had happened. And what happened is that monks were looking for what were called an anam cara. We know plenty of laws called an anam cara, but an anam cara was a soul friend that you would find. And you would find somebody, and he did this whole book about what was confession for the Irish monks. They found a soul friend who was somebody that they could talk with, somebody who had more experience but empathy about them. I think that one of the reasons why young people go to confession is that they found an anam cara. I don't think it's simply that they're dealing with particular sins. I think that they found anam cara. They found somebody who's a soul friend that could help them to look at things that they had regrets about and stuff like that. So I think that in some ways it's helpful for us to actually do what we're doing today, to try to understand why there was collapse, but also why there has been a regeneration, and to see whether or not that goes in sync with some of the more contemporary research that's actually highlighting some insights as to why once confessional was successful. Why was it successful in the 9th century? It wasn't because they had a good list of sins, it's because they had good anam cara.
I have a quick question. Over 30 years ago, I went to confession in Atlanta, and our church was a missionary church of Ireland. And I was just shocked when the priest said to me, "Where are you on your spiritual journey?" And I had never, ever thought about that before. And it was an extremely helpful way to think about my life. And fast forward, I'm part of Ignatian Volunteer Corps, and we have spiritual reflectors for all of our volunteers. And I was wondering, does spiritual reflection look like it could be part of the future for the issue of confession?
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Could you, I think the gentleman on there.
Hi, Professor O'Toole, I look forward to reading your book in the confessional in my parish on a Saturday afternoon. That's what we do. Yeah, I'm a pastor of Sacred Heart in Roslindale. Great to be here. And a couple of things that our Archbishop Henning told us priests in May regarding the reconciliation room. He's recommending that we renovate said rooms because of, as Professor Keenan said, the fear of false allegations against us as confessors, saying what's preventing someone from saying to you, Father Clary, he put his hand on my thigh in a moment of pastoral counseling. But to the point that was made a few moments ago about where we go with this, I think myself as a confessor for 28 years, thanks be to God, I let the penitent guide me. Whatever he or she is bringing, I have to ask that question if it's going to be spirituality and psychology and the old theology of the Catholic Church. Let's have the conversation. But I have to be conscious of the fact that there will be other people there waiting. In my parish, it's a predominantly Hispanic parish, and we hear confessions on Saturday afternoon and on Friday or whenever the Spirit moves, and the Spirit is truly moving. So again, thank you for your work, and it's again.
And thank you, that's very important, I think, and I want to pick up something that you mentioned, that is, I think we're going to have to expand what we mean by reconciliation. So I think therapy and things like that have to somehow be included. Because when you're sitting in a box, or even if you're sitting in a room, and there's a line of people outside, you can have a 20-minute conversation with that person, because there's people waiting to see you. So that's not the place. So sometimes after Mass and dedication, somebody says, well, you hear my confession, we're getting to very serious stuff. And I say, wait a minute. I will certainly give you absolution now, but this is not a conversation we can have right now. You need to come and see me, and we can talk about this stuff. These are complicated issues that involve more than just confession. Okay, other questions?
Look, let me just say, with regard to the remaking of confessionals as reconciliation rooms and so on, one of the things that I think many officials in the church thought was that the opportunity for face-to-face confession would get rid of some of the old problems. Because it was face-to-face, it was more like a personal conversation with a soul friend and so on. What I found in the course of the research was priests universally almost loved this. They thought, yes, that's what we should be moving towards. Lay people hated it.
Yeah.
Lay people did not do it at all. One of the keys, Kathy maybe experienced this herself privilege, one of the things, of all the things they didn't like about confession, lay people liked the fact that it was anonymous, that it was done in the dark, that it was done in private, that they didn't have to look their priest in the eye, and most important, he didn't look them in the eye as they were talking about this. So it was a reform that didn't go anywhere, and of course further, it then opened the door to the confessional as a site of sexual abuse, as an occasion for sexual abuse, as a site of abuse itself, and I document some cases of that in the book.
One of my favorite moments in movie history is, I don't know if you saw Moonstruck, the movie, but Loretta, who's played by Cher, goes to confession, and the only thing you see is the priest's hands. There's like a curtain, all you see the priest's hands in the confessional. And so Cher says, let's think about it in 2 weeks, my last confession. I stole $20 from my mother's shirt purse, and I slept with my fiance's brother, and I took the Lord's name in vain twice. And the priest says, Loretta, can we go back to this? That's a big sin. So I think even when it was quote unquote anonymous, most parish priests who were good parish priests, they knew who was confessing.
Well, maybe when you're hearing 169 at a time, it's difficult to pick out John as opposed to Joe.
But then people would go down to my parents would go to the Franciscans in Providence, and people still go to, get out of town.
Jim, I sit on the, I sit on the liturgy commission at St. Ignatius, and one of the things we've been discussing for the last couple of years is the return to what we would say piety amongst the college students. I heard the gentleman from St. Paul's mention that his confessional line was long. We're seeing a general trend towards piety, return of headdress for women, communion on the tongue. There seems to be a general trend back towards, I would say, piety amongst Catholic youth. When I was a student here in the 80s, we never did that, but I'm just seeing, we are seeing, and I'm seeing personally, a sort of new piety amongst the college-age students. Do you feel that this is going to stick long after they're out of college? And yes, the new piety does include confessions. I'm seeing at the weekday masses quite a lot, and we're seeing students ask for confession after weekday masses.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, my simple answer to your question, do I think it's going to stick, is no. Whatever it means in its current incarnation, its current expressions and so on, I have no quarrel with that. I've got no standing to have any quarrel with that. The other book I would recommend you all read, which appeared a month or two after my own, so they don't talk about one another, but I think relate to one another, is Christian Smith, sociologist at Notre Dame, who's published a book called Why Religion Went Obsolete. And he's a sociologist. The book is full of sociology, which I actually found kind of okay to read, jargon and so on. But he's looking at basically post-boomer generations, and all the trend lines are clear, he says. And he says that the social and cultural shocks of the 1990s and the early 2000s, combined with scandals within the church, Catholic Church and among evangelicals and so on, he says that all those shocks were this perfect storm for generations coming along at that point, which hasn't turned them in a secular direction. It just makes traditional, historically based, doctrinally defined religions obsolete. People in the alphabetical generations, X, Y, and Z, just live in an entirely different mental world. A world in which they would never criticize. Religion might be fine for people who go in for that sort of thing, but it's just so completely far removed from their experience, their way of thinking. Now, I was maybe more, I should have been more critical of the book than I was, but I think he's really onto something. And so the point is, we can't think that things are just going to go back to the way they used to be. That if we only stop worrying it, and if we only, most dioceses in the country, it seems to me, run these come back to confession programs during Lent. Fine. No systematic effort to say what's the overall effect of that. So I think, again, it goes to the point of, I think we need the new form that all of us are to some extent talking about. I don't think that kind of thing is going to last, because the cultural, social pressure is just going to be pulling folks in.
Catholic like all Genies don't go back into the
Yes. Christian Smith also has a study, now it's about 10 years old now, but he looked at young people, Catholic and Protestant, and in various Protestant churches, and he was very struck by the religious illiteracy of Catholics. He said, it really shows up starkly when compared to kids raised in other Christian traditions, and also a lack of practice. So I'm, encouraged to hear about new piety. I can see some of that on the Catholic University campus, and even in my own parish in Washington. Although I note that these pious young people all have 2 children, maybe 3, and they seem to be kind of finished with childbearing. But so that part has changed. But the bigger picture is a little more bleak. Now, a lot of our talk, insofar as a future, version of confession depends on ordained clergy, we have a problem. Because the priest-people ratio was much more favorable for frequent confession in the world that Jim is talking about than it is today. There just aren't enough clergy. I had a priest student a few years ago who said to me when the subject of confession on the deathbed came up, as it did in class, he said, people don't ask anymore, and thank God, because there aren't enough of us. And I thought, oh.
Yeah. You want to order that book from Amazon. Christian Smith's book is called Soul Searching. And those of you who've had me in class know, I always assign a portion of that book. He says that the real religion of teenagers, especially of Catholic teenagers, is a religion called moralistic therapeutic deism. It's actually brilliant. So the book. And he says the Catholic teenagers are in a religion where the Catholic Church runs more institutions to pass on the faith than any other group. And Catholic teenagers are incredibly inarticulate compared to other groups. So it's a very interesting work. I always get my students to read this, and some of them get very angry in reading it, which makes me think he probably pinned them to the wall.
One last question. Could I just add, but one of the things about research is that as we discovered about the Anamkara and what monks were looking for, we have to see what women were looking for during the same time. And they were looking for either their abbess or someone else, but they were not looking for men. So I think that to say that confession, the question of the scarcity of priests is going to be an impediment, I'm not sure of that. I think that as we try to figure out what this sacrament of confession will be, we'll be looking for a person who is capable of hearing confession rather than somebody who's been ordained a priest.
Will it still be sacramental?
Yes, because in fact, I was prepared to answer that. Yes.
It's like baptism. In an emergency, anybody can baptize.
Extreme motions, we could go on, but yes.
Hi, so my name is Martina. I'm a freshman here, just started, and I just kind of want to point to the fact that since being here, and it's only half of the first semester, I've been to confession more times than I have in my entire life. In fact, I was actually in confession yesterday. And I'm wondering, Professor O'Toole, why do you, if confession is an act that actually grows our connection to God stronger, why do you believe that after I leave college, in a way, I would go less to confession? And I have other questions.
Yeah, if I sounded like I was trying to prescribe your future life for you, I apologize, because that's not the case. I base it on the sociological data, and sociologists look at things in the aggregate, and not every individual is a part of the aggregate, and so on. If people still find confession meaningful, either in the traditional form or in some revised form, such as we've been talking about, if people still find it meaningful, they will continue to do it. What I think my book uncovered was that vast numbers of American Catholics no longer found it meaningful. And that itself was a phenomenon that I wanted to understand historically. And it wasn't just an on or off switch either. There are all kinds of surveys, that social scientists do starting in the 1980s on this. And the most telling one for me was one that was done again at Notre Dame in the late 80s, I think 88 or 89. And they surveyed so-called core Catholics. Not people who had been raised Catholics or baptized at church. They looked at people who were most active in their local parish. Lectors, Eucharistic ministers, religious education teachers, members of the choir, and so on. They studied that group. 25% of them said they never went to confession at all. Core Catholics, people who were there every week. 25 never went at all. 35% said they went maybe once a year. 6% went monthly, long the standing. My interest as the historian was 100 years before that, 50 years before that, those numbers would have been completely reversed, and I was interested in what had caused that decline, that collapse. Again, the future is not the historian's business. It will be some future historian's business, but that's where I'm coming from in all this.
Yeah, and so you're kind of saying that it's because of the Catholic. However, do you believe that the mentality of a priest counting, being able to tally as many people that they confess as possible kind of changes the way that the priest and the church also views confession? As in, do you think they're viewing people who go to confession as a number and trying to tick off as many in this, hour and a half time slot once a week, instead of actually giving us time to connect with them and for this time to be our therapy in a way?
Yeah, I think we'd all agree that's the ideal, and throughout its history, I think the church's view was that was the ideal of confession. That's what they were.
So why do you think that's changed?
I tell you what, why don't you read the book and send Dr. O'Toole these questions. Please join me in thanking Jim and our